curricula, and community-based participatory action research surveys. For his activism and applied scholarship, Dr. Turner has been featured in the Chronicle of Higher Education, NBC Black, the Los Angeles Times, Spectrum One News, and the New York Times. David is currently a Chancellor's Postdoctoral Fellow at the Ralph J. Bunche Center for African American Studies at UCLA. Starting in fall of 2022, Dr. Turner will join the Department of Social Welfare in the Luskin School of Public Affairs at UCLA as an assistant professor of Black life and racial justice. Let's give a warm welcome for Dr. Turner.
Hey, what is going on, people? I see the little hand clap emojis flying on the screen. I know it's about to be live, so yeah, y'all, on this Juneteenth, let's get into it. So I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen, make sure I optimize for video clips. And we are going to dive straight in. All right, team. So this presentation is titled From Plantations to Prisons, Facilitating Abolition from Enslavement to the Carceral State. First of all, I definitely want to thank the team over at the Thrivers Group and everybody that's involved with the Unurbanist Assembly for continuing to put in work around reimagining what urban planning can be. Thank you all so much for inviting me. And I definitely want to give a really big shout out, right, to Dr. Destiny Thomas and the team for continuing, right, to innovate on behalf of what it means to reimagine our urban environments, what it means to reimagine our cities, what it means to reimagine our communities. So thank you all so much for that. So again, folks, my name is Dr. David C. Turner III, and today we're going to be talking about this presentation, From Plantations to Prisons, Facilitating Abolition from Enslavement to the Carceral State. So before we dive in, just wanted to make sure that we were pretty clear about our journey that we're going to have together as a group, right? I always want to start from a place of agency, right? You know, we are going to talk about some pretty heavy topics. We're going to talk about enslavement. We're going to talk about prisons. We're going to talk about the violence that the carceral state has had on our communities, right? So I always want to center agency and joy and what it looks like for our communities, right, to resist and to fight back. So we're going to open with that, and we're going to open with the voices of young people as they have their own abolitionist imaginations. From that point, we're going to dive deeper into naming the carceral logics of enslavement and how it connects to urban design. From there, we're going to talk a little bit about resistance to fugitivity, and then towards an abolitionist vision, you know, with some key lessons, right, for us to, for us to leave with today. So this is essentially what we're going to be talking about. And again, I'm so excited to be here with you all. Thank you again, for inviting me. So again, I always like to open with the young people. So this is one of my little homies, brother named Christian Wimberly. Necessarily need policing in our schools. So without further ado, I'm going to play this music video that was put together by Christian Wimberly, as well as a brother named Dr. Aaron Whitaker over at the ACLU to talk about why we don't need school police.
There is a sluggishness, intellectual sluggishness, academic sluggishness in almost any Negro community, but this exists only because of the result that has come upon us through years and years of slavery.
Young people make some noise, and all the parents and teachers and community members and organizers who are here to back you up.
Why yes?
Why we need school police?
Hey, why we need school police? Why yes? Yeah.
Why we need school police? Yeah, I don't get it, they causing the friction, I'm really not with it. We need more counseling nurses, the lunch is not meeting criteria. Why we need school police?
Why we need school police?
I'll say it again, man, these cops killing kids and we scared of the cops. The gov is basically letting them in, I don't understand. Why we need school police?
Why we need school
If
police?
the kids fighting the police igniting, you get sent to juvie, now you were parolee. But all you needed was some counseling. This the closest thing to blasphemy. I'ma start fighting back casualties. They not harassing me, they is not saving me. Why we need school police? They need vacation, and why we need school police? Matter of fact, abolishment, we know what time it is. Tired of following orders, some youth got disorders. The cops do not know us, especially impoverished communities, soldier. They don't need training, we don't need their forces. They is not helping, so we gonna know them. You heard them, we told them, just listen to you. Abolish their forces. Started off with a dream like Martin Luther King, but the cops killing dreams, and I feel like I'm next. At war with my stress, lying they don't protect. They put that force on your neck. To them, that's another black dead. I don't know how they feel. Then we are dead. All I'm saying is the school police is not it. We need to abolish and make a new set. Yeah, abolish and make a new set. Yeah. We need to abolish and make a new set. We need to abolish and make a new set. Why we need school police? Why? Yeah, I don't get it. They causing the friction. I'm really not with it. We need more counseling nurses. The lunches they not meeting criteria. Why we need school police? Yeah, I don't get it. They causing the friction. I'm really not with it. We need more counseling nurses. The lunches not meeting criteria. If you agree, say yeah. 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 Why we need school police? 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 Yeah.
So before I actually change the slide, wanted to, I think, just I wanted to name, right, that our young people are not only aware of these issues, but our young people are actively fighting back against them. This was a campaign, that I had, the blessing to be a part of, where in the Los Angeles Unified School District, we were to defund school police by 35%, or what that translates to is about $25 million. And that was used to incubate a Black Student Achievement Plan in LAUSD. Now, young people like the ones you saw in the video, like Christian, whose rapper name is Deshaun, who was rocking the mic, or the young people you saw dancing, right? Or the folks that are present, right? Like they had been actively involved, right, in this movement for police-free schools. Now, as we're thinking about abolition, and more specifically, as we're thinking about, how the carceral state has manifested in our lives, I want us to think, how did police end up in schools in the first place? How, right, did policing become something that ended up in schools? And what one ACLU report showed, right, policing is more prevalent in schools than school nurses, right? Or policing is more prevalent in schools than counselors, right? So in what ways, right, did we get to this moment where we think that we have to rely on police to solve literally every social problem? So that is what we're going to dive into today. So the real question is, how did we get here? How did we get to this certain moment where policing is seen as the solution for essentially every social problem, right? And then what are communities doing about it? Right. So we're going to name some of these things. We're going to name some of these violences, and then we're going to look at what are some of the ways how our communities are working to fight back. So with that being said, I have another video for you, right? Again, just highlighting what it means to actually defund police, but more specifically, right, how did we get to this current political moment? So I'll play this one, and then we're going to, we're going to keep on moving through.
If you've been to a protest or have been paying attention to the news lately, there's a good chance you've heard this.
Defund the police.
Defund police departments.
Defund the police.
It's a rallying cry that has gained traction following the killing of George Floyd by police and the outbreak of global protests against anti-Black racism and police brutality. In past high-profile cases of Black Americans being killed by police, activists have called for police reform. But now they're pushing for a more radical change, defunding police departments and reimagining what public safety looks like.
No justice! No peace! No justice! No peace!
Before talking about the idea of a world without the police, we have to understand how they came to be in the first place. Police forces in northern colonial America were initially developed in response to an increase in immigration, which caused a population boom and racial and ethnic conflict. In the South, The first police departments were known as slave patrols, whose sole purpose was maintaining control of enslaved African Americans. And in Canada, early police forces were developed to forcibly remove Indigenous people from their lands.
And you can see how the police engage with Indigenous and Black communities to this day remains connected to that history of our humanity not being respected from that institution at its very inception.
Although defunding the police seems like a pretty straightforward concept, there's still a spectrum of thought around it. On one end, you have groups that want to defund the police and eventually abolish police departments entirely. And then on the other end, there's people that want to simply cut some money from police budgets and scale back their activities. Regardless, the basic concept is this: money should be taken away from police departments and reinvested in social services like education, housing, mental health, and alternatives to policing. And that idea has already started to become a reality in Minneapolis, Minnesota, where George Floyd was killed. The majority of members of the city council there recently announced that they intend to defund and dismantle the city's police department.
5 years ago, when people went out on the streets after the police murder of Tamir Rice and Eric Garner and Mike Brown and so many others, people were told, don't worry, we're going to fix it. We're going to give the police implicit bias training. We're going to have police community encounter sessions. We're going to give them body cameras and everything will be fine. But now it is clear to everyone that the police are not going to reform themselves, and that the only option is to take their toys away and diminish the scope of their power.
And while defund the police is now a part of the mainstream lexicon, it is not a new idea. Its roots can be traced back to the late 60s and early 70s, when the concept of community control of the police began to take form in academic circles and within groups like the Black Panthers. But the idea of defunding the police, as we now understand it today, emerged from the period of mass incarceration in the 80s and 90s, and the development of the prison abolition movement.
There were dozens of campaigns underway across the country before these recent events calling for dialing back police budgets and shifting those resources.
The idea is based on a recognition that policing itself is a form of harm, especially for Black communities, and that no amount of reform or training will be effective at preventing future police violence because it's an institution designed by the state to use violence to fix problems. And over the last few decades, across North America, the police have increasingly become the go-to solution to more and more of society's problems.
We're asking cops to do too much in this country. We are. We're just asking us to do too much. Every societal failure, we put it off on the cops to solve. Not enough mental health funding. Let the cop handle it. Not enough drug addiction funding. Let's give it to the cops.
And then we tell the police they're waging a war on crime and a war on drugs and a war on gangs and a war on immigrants, and we've infused them with not just military equipment, but a military ethos that gets them to view the public as this force to be neutralized.
In both Canada and the United States, Black people are more likely to be killed by police officers than white people are.
But beyond killing us, we know that we're disproportionately arrested, disproportionately surveilled, disproportionately jailed. So we're talking about systemic racism. We're not just picking police and a couple of incidents of death. We're talking about the conditions of our lives every day.
Opponents of defunding the police often favor police reform instead, and say, if we abolish the police, what are we going to do when violent crimes occur, like murder and rape?
Murders and rapes happen even with these massive police forces. And mostly they come and just take a report afterwards. They're not preventing that stuff from happening sufficiently. Where are the prevention interventions?
People like Vitali and others argue that getting rid of the police also requires coming up with alternatives to policing that better serve community needs, and that address the social factors that lead people to commit crimes in the first place, such as addiction or poverty. For example, taking millions of dollars from the police budget and allocating those funds to build public housing, or developing a mental health response program to assist people in crisis. There are many obstacles that lie ahead, though. While Black Lives Matter has gained significant public support in the last few months, the police are historically popular, especially among white Americans. But in a time when local budgets are strained due to the recession caused by the coronavirus pandemic, and as lawmakers across the US and Canada re-examine public safety amid weeks of protests against anti-Black racism, activists are arguing there's no better time to divert funds from police departments to communities in need.
People have lost the thread, and they've forgotten that the purpose of our interventions is not to decide whether the police are responsible or not, but it's to stop violence and death from happening in the first place and provide appropriate and caring responses. And that's what abolition means. It means providing a caring, non-lethal response instead of pretending police can solve every problem. We have to decide what our priorities are and why the violence has been the priority for so long. It has to change.
So as we saw in that particular video, we saw not only the history of policing, but also we saw different types of arguments about defunding police, right? About, helping to shift how we think about not only public safety, but also how we think about human dignity, right? So as we're beginning to think about this, let's take a step back and let's walk through history a little bit so that we can better understand not only how we got to this present moment, but also, right, like how these particular tools, how policing, how this type of violence shows up, right, in our daily lives. So we're going to start off with European philosopher Michel Foucault, right? Michel Foucault wrote arguably one of the most cited books about prisons and punishment called Discipline and Punish: The Birth of the Prison, right? So essentially in this book, he helps to articulate three different eras, right, that are fundamentally rooted in this idea of punishment, right? So in the pre-colonial era to the era, right, of the medieval times, punishment was literally inflicted on your body. You stole something, somebody cut your finger off or cut your hand off, or they burned something into your body. If you lied, they cut your tongue out, right? So again, right, punishment literally being inflicted on your body in that particular way. Now, as we move away from the medieval era to the Enlightenment era, punishment is now about controlling one's body. So it moves away from this idea of, just solely, right, like of solely, physically harming you, to now removing you from society, to removing you from the things that you know, dear, that you're able to engage with, right? And then from that particular point, as we begin to move more towards the industrial era, right, to present, what we're seeing is that punishment is now rooted fundamentally in controlling thought and behavior, right? So again, punishment, as it's continuing to evolve, right, is now about, we need to make people scared to do things so that way they will take away their freedoms, right? All of this is fundamentally rooted in punishing somebody's soul, right? Our entire idea of punishment is rooted in punishing their soul, or in other words, punishing their intent and behind whatever actions they took that somehow became a crime. Two people can commit murder or can physically kill someone, right? One person, right, may do it on a quote unquote accident. The other person may have intended to do it. Both resulted in a loss of human life. But the way how our courts judge it is what was their intent. And then there is an entire sort of trajectory that we go through, right, to then judge somebody's intent. They bring in their past histories, they bring in their backgrounds. If any of you have ever worked with formerly incarcerated folks, you've had to write character letters for them so that way you can help paint a better picture of them for the courts, right? Again, it's about judging somebody's soul. And with that particular framing in mind, that is how the current sort of system of incarceration, right, was undergirded and built, right, in Western society. So I wanted to make sure to bring that point in. Michel Foucault, right, further articulates, I wanted to read this quote, right, that the criminal's soul is not referred to in the trial merely to explain his crime as a factor in the judicial apportioning of responsibility, if it is brought before the court with such pomp and circumstance, such concern to understand, and such scientific application, it is because it too, as well as the crime itself, is being judged and to share in the punishment, right? So again, this is where they bring up people's history, people's past, and they use this, right, as a particular vehicle, right, to begin to punish somebody in their totality, right? So as we're thinking about prisons, as we're thinking about jails, let's make sure that we keep this in mind, right? But I do want to underscore a certain fact that Michel Foucault, again, was a European scholar who was studying things on the West, right? Like his thing wasn't necessarily naming the violence that happened not only during African enslavement, but also, right, like here in the United States in the prison regime. So Dr. Angela Davis, right, helps us to sort of further define what that looks like and how it interacts here in the United States. So Angela Davis goes on to say, right, if, as Foucault would suggest, the locus of the European mode of enslavement shifted from the body to the soul, Black slaves in the US were largely perceived as lacking a soul that might be shaped and transformed by punishment. So again, if the fundamental root of our entire carceral apparatus is, oh, we're looking to punish somebody's soul, well, if you don't believe certain people have souls, then that means you can do what you will with them because you don't believe that they can be saved in the first place, right? So Angela Davis goes on to say, within the institution of slavery, itself a form of incarceration, racialized forms of punishment developed alongside the emergence of the prison system within and as a negative affirmation of the free world from which slavery was twice removed. Thus, the deprivation of white freedom tended to affirm the whiteness of democratic rights and liberties. So again, even if you were a white person and incarcerated, you still, right, had liberties. You still had rights that enslaved folks did not and would never have, right? As white men acquired the privilege to be punished in ways that acknowledge their equality and the racialized universality of liberty, the punishment of Black slaves was corporal, concrete, and particular, right? So as we're looking at how we get to this moment, at how we got, from plantations to prisons, and how, right, this carceral system, right, this system of incarceration and enslavement operates in our communities, I want you to remember, right, that as the West, right, is continuing to develop prisons, right, like, and continuing to use it as a tool and a vessel, right, to modernize punishment and move away from the more medieval and hostile and inhumane tactics of, putting brands on people and cutting off fingers. I want you to remember, right, that for enslaved African folks, right, that process never stopped. Right? The process never stopped of punishment physically being in your body, as well as the process never stopped, right? For punishing people and continuing to punishing them to correct their behavior, right? In fact, it was used as the primary tool to do that. So, right, as we're thinking about this and as we're thinking about urban design, I want you to continue, right, like to keep this in your mind, especially, right, the idea of what punishment looks like, because that is definitely connected to urban planning, especially for my planners out there who are on the call. So what are these different carceral technologies, right, and logics that were perfected by enslavement? So there was physical containment, right? So literally containing your person, your physical body. There's geographical containment, right? So being able to contain and control everything that's literally around you. There is the corporal punishment, and more specifically, right, like there is, right, this idea that we can do things to your body, right? So so with that being said, right, like we're going to take a look at how some of these things manifest themselves in urban planning. So the picture you see on your left, right, that is a picture of people who are incarcerated in what they called a chain gang, right, in the early 1930s, right? It looks very similar, right, to the image that you see on the right, which was a slave ship that was used to take our ancestors from one continent to another, right? Where, we lost millions of people in the Atlantic, as well as, a lot of people just did not make it over here to not only to the United States, but also to parts of the Caribbean and Central and South America, right? So again, right, this physical containment, literally stacking bodies on top of one another, right, is one of the ways how we see this type of connection between not only the carceral state but also the slave state, and how enslavement, right, has never really stopped, right? It continued and continued and continued and continues to this day. In fact, I recently saw in the state of California, right, that they're trying to block any kind of amendment to the 13th Amendment because the prison labor is too cheap to let go of. Again, right, you have prisoners in the state of California, right, who are responsible for, putting together ballots, who are responsible, right, not only for our license plates, but also who are responsible for solving our wildfires, right? Like these folks, right, who oftentimes can't get jobs doing these same things once they're released, right, are being confined and are stuck in a situation where the state refuses to give them the rights as soon as they're released, right? So again, I want us to never forget, right, how this type of physical containment continues to manifest to this day. And that image that you see on your left, in some county jails, that's still what it looks like to this day. So this is what we're talking about when we talk about physical containment, right? Second, I wanted to go to this idea of isolation, right? So one of the things that scholars talk about, folks like Dennis Childs and others, right, is how incarceration is a form of social death, right? Where even though you may not necessarily be physically dead, right, like you are still removed from everything that you know, love, and hold dear. You're removed from your family, you're removed from your friends, you're removed from your community, right? And that isolation, right, is something that they use as a psychological tactic to literally kill people, right, to kill their spirits. So the image that you see on your right is from the Whitney plantation. That is an isolation container, right, that then became what we now know today as solitary confinement, right, that is used as a way to essentially break people down, right, to punish them. Now, we all had to experience what it was like to stay home during the pandemic. And a lot of us are changed forever, right, by what it is that we experienced during the pandemic. Imagine what it's like to spend days, weeks, months, sometimes even years by yourself in a container like that. Imagine what it is like to spend that amount of time in a container like that and what it will do to you. The reason why I bring this up, right, is again, this type of psychological violence, this type of psychological containment, right, is one of the tools of the carceral state that has evolved and was perfected in enslavement, right? So as we're connecting plantations to prisons, I want you to keep that in mind. Third, again, as we're talking about physical containment, I wanted to think about the tools that were used, right, to prevent folks from running away, to prevent folks from leaving enslavement, right? So I wanted to show you a little bit about what this looks like. That collar that you see are those collars that you see on the left-hand side of the screen, right? Those were tools that were used to prevent enslaved Africans from escaping slavery, right? They were used, if you're wearing this, you won't be able to dig through trees. You won't be able to move in a particular way, right? They had bells on some of them so that way you can still hear people, right? Now, what makes that so different from the technological advancement of ankle monitors or incarcerating people in their own community, right? As other abolitionists would articulate. So the reason why I wanted to bring this particular image up again, right, is to demonstrate some of the ways how our current structural design and even in things that we think are progressive by, let's release people and put them on probation, right? Like this is what we're talking about. We're talking about literally monitoring people and keeping track of them and ensuring that they don't, quote unquote, run away. This is the remnants of the slave state that is showing up as the carceral state. Now I want to talk a little bit about geographical containment, right? So literally where you are in a particular time dictates the type of life that you're going to live. As we've seen across different types of urban landscapes in the United States, right? Urban geography is designed and rooted fundamentally in systemic racism. Whether we're talking about redlining, whether we're talking about the development of freeways, or in this particular case that we're talking about today, whether we're talking about gang injunctions, right? And how in a particular neighborhood, right, through the different types of urban policy, right, that gets passed in different city councils, and sometimes even at the state level or at county levels, right, you will see how different types of communities are then policed in ways that are hostile and incarcerate entire communities by association, even if they don't do anything wrong. They just happen to live there, right? So we're going to listen, right, to someone who some of you may know, right, talk a little bit about what this type of geographical containment, what these type of policies do to communities. Sorry about that. It's supposed to start at a particular time. All right, we'll start it there.
People understand the different status that people could have.
Yeah, I mean, like we just said, like if you an active gangbanger and you really on your shit every day, you know what I mean? It's a whole different lifestyle. You waking up, doing your thing, homie, going in and pressing your line. You know what I'm saying? You probably banging on every nigga you run across, asking niggas where they from. If they say the wrong hood, you might get off or get cracking, bust on a nigga. Like, niggas know what an active member out here do. Now, if you from your area, whether you from it and you never been active, whether you've been active before and you fell back due to whatever reasons, you know what I'm saying, and you moved on to something else, which is my scenario. Like, I do music. I'm chasing a goal. I'm pursuing my dream. So, you know what I mean, I'm realistic with myself. I see the steps you got to take in the work you got to put in, and that's what I do day to day.
So it's certainly possible to be from a gang and not engage in criminal activity.
Most definitely. But I mean, some of the laws in California have been twisted to where just being from a gang is the crime. So, you know what I mean, if you're around your homies and your hood happen to be under an injunction, being around each other is a violation of you know what I'm saying, a law. So in some circumstances, they creating laws to bear something that beforehand wouldn't be illegal becomes illegal just because of your affiliation, like gang enhancements for your crimes.
Now in 2003, your neighborhood was actually hit with an injunction. How did that affect people you know and the people that lived in that neighborhood?
I mean, it had a immediate effect on the people that was placed under that injunction, whose names was on it, and it made it to where, like I just said, like something that beforehand was perfectly legal became illegal just based on they filed a complaint, and you know what I mean, now they got jurisdiction to take you to jail because you got a white t-shirt on, or because you got a phone in your hand, or because you hanging out with two people you grew up with your whole life. Now at the same time, it is a violent.
So why do I bring this up? Why do we talk about gang injunctions? Why are we talking about gang banging, right, as we're talking about urban planning and urban policy, right? So again, if we go back to African enslavement, right, one of the first things that happened as soon as enslavement ended was the institution of Black codes, right? Black codes were policies and practices, right, that essentially made being Black illegal in order to cycle people through the carceral system, right? So let's remember, as we saw in the video before I started the presentation, that the 13th Amendment says enslavement shall be abolished, right, except for as punishment of a crime where the party's been duly convicted. So if you're finding new ways to criminalize entire communities, if you're finding new ways to ensure that whole communities are not allowed to rise up, whole communities are not allowed to even come together, right, then what does that mean for the perpetuation of this particular type of carceral system, right? It means that people are not allowed to organize. It means, right, that communities at any point in time can be swept up in this carceral state. And what the effects this has, it has effects where entire generations have been stolen and have been put into a system that dehumanizes them and their entire community, everybody who looks like them, right? So as we're talking about geographical containment and what this looks like in urban planning and urban policy, right, like understand that that is one of the ways that it manifests. It's not the end all be all, it is one of the ways that it manifests, right? And finally, I do want to just make a quick parallel to physical punishment. One of the things that we heard from in one of the videos that we saw is that police and everybody who represents the carceral apparatus, they are violence workers, right? Their entire job is to use violence, to use physical force to inflict the state's will on a particular group, right? So as we're seeing here in this particular example, right, this image from, I think it was last year, of Haitians who were trying to get to the United States and who are being harassed and harmed by Border Patrol with whips, and the parallels to what this looks like with African enslavement. Again, right, like this is the state ensuring that it can inflict violence, right, and use violence as that primary tool to harm and hurt communities, right? So what does this look like? It looks like George Floyd. It looks like Breonna Taylor. It looks like Tony McDade. It looks like Ayanna Stanley Jones. It looks like Sandra Bland. It looks like all of the hundreds of thousands of names of people who have had their lives stolen by the state in the name of the state. And because of that, right, like what we're seeing is modern day lynching. What we're seeing is modern day whippings and beatings, right? Like what we're seeing is modern day castration. This is the perpetuation of the carceral state and how the carceral state, not carceral, but of the slave state, and how the slave state has transformed into the carceral state, right? So again, what does all of this mean, right? I want to return to Angela Davis. The justification for why we continue to rely on prisons, why we continue to rely on these harmful tools and tactics is we think it is a way to solve social problems, right? So what does Angela Davis say about this particular piece? Prisons do not disappear social problems. They disappear human beings. Homelessness, unemployment, drug addiction, mental illness, and illiteracy are only a few of the problems that disappear from the public view when human beings contending with them are relegated to cages. One of the stats that we used to rely on as I was doing youth work right here in Los Angeles, working to ensure that young brothers who had been system impacted do not recidivate and go back into the system, was that a high school diploma, right, literally reduces your chance of being incarcerated from over 90% to down to 23%, right? So our primary job was to ensure that young Black men, right, these young Black boys were graduating from high school because literally the diploma, right, reduced incarcerated, right, over 60 percentage points. So with that being said, that was our primary tool. Again, but that's us trying to address an actual social problem, right, as opposed to just saying, oh, well, these boys themselves are the problem, right? So why do I bring this up? Why does this matter, right? Because when we look at what it means to invest in our communities, when we look at what it means to do work in our communities, it means making sure that we're working to stir up trouble, that we're working to be fugitives, right? And we're going to talk a little bit about what fugitivity is. So, what do we do about this outgrowth of the carceral regime? What do we do about, right, this outgrowth of chattel slavery? And this is where we return to fugitivity, right? Stealing what we can, taking what we can, like Frederick Douglass took in education and learned how to read and write by manipulating white children to teach him letters and to teach him how to read. Or like Harriet Tubman not only took her freedom, but took the freedom of hundreds of other enslaved Africans here in the United States. It is fugitivity, is stealing, right? So what is fugitivity, right? What does fugitivity mean? Dr. Jarvis Givens at Harvard University, he articulates fugitivity as this. Fugitivity enunciates subversive practices of Black social life in the African diaspora over and against the persistent violence of white supremacy and its technologies of surveillance and domination that were bound up in and animated by the chattel principle, right? It is the constant seeking of an outside to white supremacy that might elusively be understood as Black freedom. I want to repeat this part because this part is important. It is the constant seeking of an outside to white supremacy that might elusively be understood as Black freedom. So this seeking outside, right, of what we know as white supremacy, this looking away, right, to find something else, to find something different, leaving the plantation, hiding from massa, right, like learning how to read and write when you're not supposed to. It is this particular type of framework, right, that Dr. Givens refers to as fugitivity, right? So this is in a book about fugitive pedagogy. In other words, the ways how Black educators were in secret, right, teaching Black history, even when they weren't supposed to be teaching Black history, right? So fugitive pedagogy and urban planning. So what does this actually look like? We're going to go through some examples in a minute, right? But Dr. Givens, right, he further goes on to articulate that Black achievement and criminality, right, were closely linked transgressions in an anti-Black world. So Black achievement and criminality were closely linked transgressions in an anti-Black world, right? So if Black achievement can be seen as criminal, then our tools as planners, organizers, educators, advocates, etc., right, should be seen as fugitive acts to build the momentum to ultimately eliminate the carceral regime in its entirety. Because again, fugitivity, right, and working to steal ourselves away, working to resist, working to fight back, right? Whether it's Nat Turner, right, with a pitchfork and a mob, whether it's Frederick Douglass learning how to read and write, whether it's Harriet Tubman stealing away and taking all these people to freedom, right, through the Underground Railroad, all these different fugitive acts ultimately led to the abolition of slavery. So how many fugitive acts is it going to take us to abolish the carceral state? How many things are we going to need to do? Everybody can participate. Everybody can participate in their own way. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you how some of the young people who I've worked with have worked to take their own fugitive acts in order to transform policy practice and ultimately move us closer to abolition. So what you see on the screen are survey results from the Brother Son Self Coalition Safety and Youth Justice Survey. Our young people had surveyed over 3,300 young people across LA County to find out not only how they're experiencing law enforcement, but also too, what are some of the things that they want to change? What are some things that they want to see right in their communities? And as we went through the data to look at, okay, well, how are young people experiencing law enforcement? What are some of the things that we're seeing, right? To the upper right-hand side of the screen, one of these particular data points, and this is what really, shocked me, right, was that 1 out of every 3, or more than 1 out of every 3 youth who were harmed by law enforcement were never arrested or officially detained. So again, I want to make sure, that we go ahead and bring this point back, right? Again, right? The carceral state and the slave state used physical punishment as a way to remind people who was in power, right? So if we're seeing that, and if we're seeing how young people, right, nearly 1 in 3 young people who were harmed by law enforcement were never arrested or officially detained, what does that mean? It means that the police are using violence as a way to demonstrate that they are in control of these young people, their communities, and everything that they know and love and hold dear, right? So our youth use this survey not only on a statewide level to help to advocate for different types of changes of use of force, but our young people use this survey, right, in their campaign to defund law enforcement. they use this survey, right, as further justification for moving away from school policing and investing money into Black students and Black student achievement, right? And why that matters, why that is, because in our survey, Black youth were 16% of our survey, but they were 39%, or 37.9% of all the youth harmed by law enforcement. We often think, right, that young people who are harmed by law enforcement, that is uniquely a cisgender heterosexual male problem, but our survey determined that was a lie, right? So with that being said, we also found that 25%, or 1 out of 4 young people who were physically harmed by law enforcement identified as LGBTQ. We also identified, right, that in our survey, nearly half of the survey participants, right, didn't feel safe when interacting with law enforcement, as well as felt that law enforcement was overly aggressive. So again, right, like they use this data, right? This is participatory action research. This is young people doing research themselves, helping to lead the process, right? Like they use this data to advocate for social transformation in their communities. This is the power of young people helping to drive things. And this is also what fugitivity looks like, because what I did was I took the resources that from my institution at UC Berkeley, and we used those resources for free in our communities, right, in order to do the work, right? It looks like taking from the university and returning it to the community. It looks like you taking those resources, tools, and knowledge, right, and using that as a way to help your communities transform, right? It looks like you learning how to read, like Frederick Douglass learned how to read. So, right, what does it also look like to do this type of political education? How do we actually facilitate this and make it happen? Now, there are a lot of urban planners and a lot of other folks, right, who, as they're designing urban environments and cities, they continue to illustrate how per square mile, certain groups of people don't have access to the same type of things that other groups of people have access to, whether that's farmers markets or grocery stores, or there's an over inundation of fast food restaurants, right? People over at the Social Justice Learning Institute will call a certain community not a food desert, but a food swamp, right? Where there's plenty of food around, but none of it is good for you. So what does this look like, and how do you actually work, right, to transform these type of conditions? So to the left that you see on this screen, this is Jathan Melendez, right? He is now a youth organizer and was a young person at Community Coalition. And in an interview, right, where I had the opportunity to talk to him, he was telling me about a pedagogical tactic that they do over at Community Coalition in order to facilitate change with their young people. And that pedagogical tactic, right, is something that they call the tour, right? The South LA versus West LA tour, right? Where they literally take you in a van and you have to write down the number of liquor stores that you see. You have to write down the number of police that you see. You have to write down the resources in your community versus the resources over in West LA, Culver City, and in areas where there are actually white people, right? So what this looks like, Jathan had said that just gave us an opportunity to see how many liquor stores were in our communities versus West LA, how many hospitals. It's like visiting a whole other foreign environment and just being like, damn, what would life be like if I was a student here? What would life be like if I was living in this community? What I got to do to make my community look like that, right? So again, it's this process of politicizing, right? It again, as Dr. Givens articulated, right, Black achievement and Black criminality oftentimes were inextricably linked, right? So, you know, for us, right, like education, Black education, right, political education, right, oftentimes has been known as a criminal act. So I'm asking you, as a matter of fact, I'm demanding of all of us, right, to embrace that fugitive spirit, to embrace that spirit of criminality, because our relationship to this country in and of itself is a criminal one, right? And I'm not talking about stealing purses. I'm talking about, right, learning how to read when you're not supposed to. I'm talking about learning, right, that what's happening in your community is not supposed to be this way. This is what I mean when I talk about, you know, embracing this criminal spirit, right? Like, this is what I mean when I talk about embracing that fugitive spirit, right? That our communities wanted to ensure that we continue to embrace and to learn, right? So with that being said, I do want to make sure that we wrap up and that we have some time, right, for engagement. So, just some key lessons from today as planners, organizers, educators, and advocates. What is our responsibility to seek the outside of white supremacy, to seek outside the plantation, right? To build outside of these things we know as Black feminists, and so the intellectual God mom, Audre Lorde, said, what does it mean to build things without using the master's tools, right? But that's not exactly what she said, but y'all know what I mean. The master tools never dispense with the master's house. How can we challenge the notions of punishment and control to assert Black autonomy and freedom, right? So how do we continue to build on abolitionist demands, to build on abolitionist envisioning, right? And do this in organizing in whatever capacity we're in, whether you're in urban planning and you're designing transportation, whether you're in public policy and you're working more closely with schools, or whether you're a future lawyer or you're in civil engineering, whatever it is you may be in, right? How do we continue to challenge the notions of punishment and control to assert Black autonomy and freedom? And then finally, and this is the question I want to leave you all with, what are we willing to do to get free? Right? How much work are we willing to put in? What are we willing to sacrifice to ensure that us and our communities have access to freedom, have access to justice, and access to transformation? I ask you that today, and I want you to ask yourselves that every day, because it is at the limit, the edge of what we're willing to do for freedom. That is how we're going to make sure that we actually get free. So with that being said, thank you all so much for your time. I really appreciate the invitation and appreciate being here. This is my contact information, so please be sure to, take a photo of this. Feel free to follow me on social media, either Twitter or Instagram at Dr._Kunta23. And finally, free my boy Devontre, who is seen on this screen. So thank you all so much for your time. I really appreciate the invitation. And yeah, if we have time, I would love to take a couple of questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Turner. We do have a couple of minutes if anyone has any questions to put in the chat. We are running 10 minutes, about 15 minutes behind, but those of you who are looking to be a part of any of the breakouts, don't worry, we haven't started them. You're not missing anything yet. So if you were holding back on a question because of the timing, definitely feel free to send something to the Q&A box. And we'll pause and see if anyone has a question. Thank you so much. I was in here yelling at the screen. I said, I like this church. I'm going to go to this church.
Hey, I come from a line of preachers, so so forgive.
He said, turn to your neighbor and find the fugitivity in them. And I took that serious.
Look at your neighbor and say, neighbor, we gonna get free.
Okay, well, I'm not seeing questions coming in the chat. There are 2 breakout sessions for this segment. One of them is the evolution of deportation centers, a perspective from Europe. And the other is the prison industrial complex and Asian people in the United States. Both of them are going to be amazing. So if you are staying with us through the night, please migrate over to unurbanist.com to find the links to those rooms. And thank you again, Dr. Turner. It's an honor to know you.
I be trying. I'm trying to be like you when I grow up.
No. I'm trying to be like you.
For sure. All right. So thank you all so much for having me. Again, please feel free to follow me on any of the social media platforms, as well as send me an email and drop me a line. And yeah, folks, let's get free. So yeah, man. Big shout out to the Unurbanist Assembly planning team and everybody over at Thrivers Group. So thank you all so much.
Yeah, #let's get free.
Hey, let's do it.
Good night. Or come to another session. You don't get to go to bed yet. Come to another session.
But hey, I'll make it to one of them. You know, I might come up in one of the early morning ones, but yeah. All right, T.
Bye.